To refresh your memory, over the last two episodes, we first used model metadata to define how this user interface should look, and then we used the model binding system so that when you actually post some data, all the form fields are mapped onto a job ad instance, and this is then passed on to your action method. But what we haven't thought about so far is what happens if the user posts bad data. So if I just clear this form out, and if I actually deliberately remove even the default values and then try to submit the form, we'll see that it's accepted, and all the field values are blank or 0 or the default value for the type, and that's not really any good at all. Naturally, we want to validate the input and control which values we accept. The easiest way to get started with validation is to use some validation attributes from data annotation. You'll remember from the metadata episode that we created a buddy class to hold the metadata for our job ad model object, and we used data annotations attributes like display name and UI hint to control how the framework would scaffold the form. We also created this custom metadata attribute, option, that controls which options appear in a list of radio buttons. In terms of validation, we can define that the title field is required just by saying required. We can also use data annotation's string length attribute to define a maximum length for that field. We could say also that the location field is required, and we could say that salary has to fall within a certain range. We'll say a minimum of 5,000, and I don't really want to specify a maximum, so I'm just going to use int.maxValue. So there's a couple of things to notice at this point. One is that I haven't bothered to put required attributes on the salary or the publish from date fields, and that's because since they're value types, they are implicitly considered to be required anyway. If I didn't want them to be required, I'd have to turn them into nullable types. And the other thing is that the range attribute has constructor overloads that let you specify boundaries in terms of ints or doubles, but not in terms of decimals. So I can't specify decimal.maxValue as one of the boundaries because they'll just get a compiler error. There is no such a constructor overload. I'll use int.maxValue, and that's close enough anyway, because int.maxValue is bigger than any realistic salary anyway, so that's fine. I only really want to specify a minimum to make sure that nobody accidentally puts in a daily or hourly rate by mistake. So now I've got these validation attributes, let's try submitting the form again and see what difference it makes. I'll switch back to the browser, I'll go back and I'll submit a blank form, and we'll see that it makes no difference at all. So you might think the framework has ignored your validators, but it hasn't. Actually, it has run them. It's just that we didn't tell it to do anything with the results of the validation. We can see what it's done a little better if we use the Visual Studio debugger. I'll switch over to the admin controller, and on the action method that receives the form post, I'll put a breakpoint on the first line. Then I'll attach Visual Studio's debugger to the built-in web server, and I shall resubmit the blank form. And now we see we've hit the breakpoint. And the thing that I wanted to look at here is a temporary storage area called model state. And this is an area that the framework uses to keep track of information about the model object that we're working on at the moment. And in particular, it contains information about the results of the model binding process. It stores all the incoming attempted values and also the results of validating those values. In particular, we can notice immediately that it's got a property called isValid, which is currently false. To find out more about why it's not valid, let's take a look at the entry for the title field. We can see that it's got one error, and if we want to find out what that error is, we'll see that the required attribute that we applied has been run, and it's registered this error message: the title field is required. Another thing to notice before we move on is the value property. And we can see here that the framework has stored the incoming attempted value, which was an empty string. And that will become important in a moment. So to summarise, model state stores the incoming attempted values, whether or not they're valid, and also a list of any validation errors that the validation system has recorded. So if the framework knows that the incoming data was invalid, why didn't it display any errors? Well, that's because we didn't add any code to tell it to do so. So I'll exit the debugger now, and I'll add some code to respond to incoming invalid values. And what I'll say is, if the model state says that the incoming data is all valid, then we'll do what we did before, which is displaying that view that tells you what information you've just posted. But if it isn't, I'm just going to redisplay the form. Right, let's try again. I'll recompile, switch back to my browser, and resubmit a blank form again. Now that's a bit different. It didn't accept the data, and some of the form fields have gone red, but it's not displaying any error messages, so it's not really clear what's going on. And the reason it's not displaying any error messages is that there's no instruction in my view to tell it to do so. So I'll add that now, and to do that I will go to View, and the easiest way of adding a list of validation error messages is to use the html.validation summary helper, and I can give a little title for that. And now I've done that, I'll try again for a third time, submit a blank form, and at last we do get a list of the errors. Also, if I enter an excessively long title, then we get a suitable error message. Now there's three things I want to observe at this point. The first one is that when aspmvc re-renders your view, it doesn't start off blank, it starts off with the previous data that was in the form. In other words, it retains the user's values. And this is not at all like how ASP.NET Web Forms does it. There's no view state here, the controls are not actually maintaining their own state. Instead, it's just a convention. The convention is that input controls try to pre-populate themselves using any value that they can find in model state. As you saw earlier, the model binding system populates model state title with the incoming title value, whether or not it's valid. So the job title input box finds that very long string value and uses it to pre-populate itself. This is exactly what you normally want. You want to retain the user's values even if they're not valid, so that the user has an opportunity to correct them. And because textbox and the other input helpers respect that convention, you get that behavior without having to write any code. The second observation is that the invalid fields have gone red. And this is because when HTML helpers render themselves, they look in model state and see if they correspond to an invalid entry, and if so, they add an extra CSS class that you can use to highlight the field as invalid. And the third observation is that some of these validation error messages aren't very good. They don't look like they were written for a human, they look like they were written for a computer programmer, particularly this one. So let's fix that by entering some custom error messages. Controlling the validation error messages is very easy. I just go back to the metadata class, and then on each validation attribute I can specify what the error message should be. Easy as that, please enter a title. And now I'll just add custom messages on each of the others. Remember I said earlier that value type properties were implicitly required? Well, if that's so, how do we control the error message that appears for those? Well, to control that, we can explicitly add a required attribute for those properties. And another one for publish from date. And there we go. In case you're thinking that you don't really want to hard code the error messages directly into the metadata, I'll mention now that as an alternative you can reference strings in an external resources file. And that's particularly helpful if you're developing a multi-language application. I'll recompile, switch back to the browser, resubmit the bad form data, and this time we get our custom error messages. Well, that's a lot better, but there is one slight problem at the moment, and that is this message here, no more than 50 characters. It's not really clear which field that applies to. We've just got this flat list of messages. It might be easier for the user if each error message appeared alongside the field that it refers to. And we can do that. Instead of using a validation summary, we'll use a different HTML helper to place validation messages at specific points in the view. I'll switch back to the view. I will get rid of the validation summary. And instead, underneath each field, I use a different HTML helper, html.validationMessage4, and then I tell it which field I want to display validation messages about. And I'll copy and paste that and do the same thing for salary here, and for location here, and for the publish from date here. And I can't really expect there to be any validation error messages about a checkbox, so I'll ignore that one. Now I save that view and I'll resubmit the bad data again, and now each of the validation message helpers picks out the messages related to specific fields, and that makes this message a lot easier to understand. And I'll just check that entering valid data gets past the validation check. So if I just have a title, then that box won't be read anymore. And I'll enter valid values for the other fields. And this time the form post goes through. You've now seen some examples of using the range rule, the required rule, and the string length rule, so you might be wondering what other validation attributes exist and how you can use them. Well, we can go through the whole set pretty easily because there's only 5. Firstly, they all inherit from the validation attribute abstract base class. As you've seen, there's the required rule, which says that a non-empty value must be provided. And as I mentioned, value type properties are implicitly considered to have a required attribute even if you haven't specified one. Then there's the range rule, which only applies to numerical types, and that specifies upper and lower bounds for the numerical value. There's the string length rule, which obviously sets a maximum length for a string. Also, if you're running on .NET 4, you can specify a minimum length for the string as well. One that you haven't seen is the regular expression attribute, which obviously requires that the value must satisfy the regular expression. And finally, there's the data type attribute, and you saw an example of us using this in the metadata episode when we used data type to control how fields should be scaffolded. Okay, well, how many of these actually contain useful validation logic? Well, as you've just seen, the required, range and string length rules are all supported for server-side validation and for client-side as well, though you haven't seen that yet. And also regular expression implements useful validation logic. The slightly awkward surprise, however, is that data type does not contain any useful validation logic, even though it inherits from validation attribute. So you can specify data type date or data type email address, but it won't actually validate anything, because its isValid method is hard-coded just to return true for all possible values. Considering that, I'm not really sure why it inherits from validation attribute, so that's just something for you to watch out for. If, for example, you do want to validate an email address, you'll have to either express it as a regular expression or implement some custom validation logic. A very simple way of doing custom validation logic is to manually register errors in model state directly from your action method. As a slightly quirky example, let's imagine that we want to enforce a professional sounding tone on our job listings, and we don't want people to use certain words in job titles. If so, we could express that logic like this. If the incoming job ad's title contains a bad word, then we can say to model state, we want to add a model error, we'll tell it which field this error refers to, and give an error message. We have to tell it which key to register the error under, so that the correct HTML.ValidationMessage4 helper can pick it out. And then we know that if there's at least one error inside model state, then the isValid property will return false, which means that we would reject the incoming data. I'll recompile and try that out. And there we go, the custom validation logic is running. And if you do have validation logic that's very specific to a single action, then it's perfectly good just to put that logic directly inside the action like we've done here. But what if we want to generalize and reuse this custom logic? We might want to create our own custom validation attribute that we can use on different model classes. Let's have a go at doing that. First, I'll delete this custom logic, and then I'll switch over to the metadata class and think about how I would like to express this rule. I'd like to express it something like this. Of course, right now I can't do that. I'll get a compiler error because there's no such class as excludeWords attribute. Let's create that class. Inside my domain, I'll create a new metadata class. It's just a regular C# class. And because we want it to function as an attribute, it has to inherit from the attribute base class. Also, we're trying to pass some words to it as an array as a constructor parameter. Let's add that constructor now. And I'll save that value in a property. Okay, let's try this out. If I compile and submit the bad word, we see that the validation logic hasn't applied because there is no validation logic. I've just created an attribute. I'm going to have to create a custom validation provider that detects instances of excludeWords attribute and translates it into a model validator instance, which is the thing that aspmvc can understand. To create a custom validation provider, I'll start by making a new class. And a custom validator provider can inherit directly from model validator provider, which is an abstract base class for all model validator providers. But normally it's easier to inherit from associated validator provider, because this automatically gives you support for buddy classes, which is something we're using. Now I have to implement a method called getValidators, which takes all this context information, including a list of any attributes that have been detected on the property. And I need to return an enumerable of model validators, and a model validator is the thing that aspmvc understands and is able to call to get validation results. First, I'm going to try and find any of the excluded words attributes that are associated with this property. And then I'll iterate over that collection. And for each one I need to return a model validator. That's going to have to be another custom class that I haven't created yet. I'll just pretend that I had created it, and so this code would look something like this. And I don't really know what constructor parameters I'm going to use just yet, so first I'll implement this custom validator. And like all validators, it has to inherit from model validator. And to implement the constructor, I first have to notice that the base constructor requires me to supply a model metadata and a controller context, so I'll ask for one of those on this constructor. And I'll pass those to the base. Also, I'm going to need to know which words the user wants me to exclude right now. I'll take those as an extra parameter. And I'll store those on a local field. Now finally I can fill in the constructor parameters up here. So I need to pass the metadata, the controller context, and the words to exclude from the attribute that we've detected. Now I know it might not be obvious what's going on here, so let me recap. First, we created the excluded words attribute, which you can use to define which list of words should be excluded on a given model property. But aspmvc doesn't know anything about that, so we had to create a custom validation provider, which inherits from the associated validator provider base class, and that's going to find instances of our custom excluded words attribute and translate them into something that aspmvc does understand, which is instances of model validator. We had to pass the list of excluded words all the way through this process so that it can be stored on the validator, and now finally we can use that in our custom validation logic. The model validator base class lets us override the validate method, and the first convention we should try and fit in with is that if no value has been provided, we should accept it as valid. If we don't do that, then we're implicitly saying that the field is required, but really we want to give the programmer the choice of whether or not to use required independently. So firstly, if there's no incoming value, we're not going to return any validation results, which means that we're saying it's valid. Secondly, we can only really validate strings here because of what this validation rule actually means, so we'll convert the model to a string. And now we can iterate over all of the excluded words, and for each one, if the model contains this word, then we'll return a validation error. And I can specify a custom message. In fact, actually I'll make that a little better. First I'll define a constant value that defines our default error message. And then I'll tell the user exactly which word they're not allowed to use. Of course, this is very simple logic. I'm not really even properly detecting word boundaries here. You could improve this if you wanted. But anyway, let's see if this now works. Hopefully the last step is to tell aspmvc to use our custom validation provider. And like most custom providers, we can configure that in global.asax, just like all these other custom things we've already got. Model validator providers.providers.add, and then we add an instance of our new provider. Right, finally let's compile and try this out. I'll submit the bad entry again, and it has correctly rejected that entry. I'll try a different bad entry. That works as well, and I'll try a good entry, and this time it's let through. To recap this one last time, We've got a custom validation attribute that doesn't mean anything to ASP.NET MVC, but we do have a validation provider that can detect these attributes and turn them into instances of model validator, which ASP.NET MVC does understand, and it will call our validate method, and then we can iterate through each of the words that we want to exclude, and for each bad word we yield a model validation result, and ASP.NET MVC will register that in model state, and then it will get displayed on the screen. And our controller doesn't need to know anything about this, and we can reuse this excluded words rule in as many different places as we want. Of course, the point of the validation provider system is to let you define your validation rules any way you want. It doesn't just have to be custom attributes. You could instead get your validation data from XML files or from a database or something. As long as you return model validator instances, it will all fit into the system and work fine. Let's now think about client-side validation. As I'm sure you know, when most people are using a web application, they don't expect to wait for an entire round trip to the server every time they submit a form before getting any feedback about things that might have been invalid. They expect the messages to appear instantly. In other words, they expect client-side validation. Implementing that in ASP.NET MVC 2 can be extremely simple. At a minimum, all you really have to do is check that you're referencing a couple of scripts that are provided with a default project. Here I've added them into my master page. I've added them at the bottom of the page just to prove that they can appear there at the bottom, as well as up at the top in the head section if you prefer. In case you didn't know, the recommendation is to load all external JavaScript files from script tags at the bottom of your document rather than in the head section if you can, because it improves the perceived performance of your site. When you have script tags at the top of the page, the browser blocks all of its HTTP download pipelines until it's downloaded those scripts. Anyway, the two scripts that you need in this case are Microsoft Ajax.js, and that's the main script in ASP.NET Ajax, and Microsoft MVC Validation.js, which uses Microsoft Ajax and implements MVC style validation. As I said, these are both included in the default project template. Now, assuming you've referenced these two scripts, enabling client-side validation is incredibly simple. All you have to do is say html.enableClientValidation. Hopefully then, with this in place, if I reload the form, and I try to submit it blank, we now get client-side validation, and you can see that if I start to enter some data, the error messages disappear one by one without me having to submit the form. And if all the client-side rules pass, then it's likely that all the server-side rules will pass as well. Of course, just because you're doing client-side validation doesn't mean you can stop doing server-side validation. It's very important still to do that because a user might disable JavaScript in their browser, or they might just forge an arbitrary HTTP post request directly to your server. But with the way we've built this application, we are still doing server-side validation. We never turn that off. And in fact, that's quite important because some of the fields right now can't be validated on the client. Like the publish from date, we don't have all that clever date parsing logic on the client, so if I type in some arbitrary string there won't be any client-side message, but when I submit it to the server-side validation still runs. And if you're interested in how this works on the client, let's take a look at the HTML source code. We can see that just after the form tag has finished, ASP.NET MVC has emitted a little JavaScript block, which includes a JavaScript object notation definition of your rules. And if we scroll along a little bit, you can see that it includes all of our custom error messages, like this, and it includes the parameters that define exactly how our rules are specified. And the Microsoft MVC validation script picks up this JSON definition of the rules and enforces them all on the client. So that was all incredibly easy. And if you're only using the built-in data annotations attributes, that's really all you have to do, because they'll all be respected on the client. But our application is slightly more advanced. It's got custom server-side rules, and we might want to create client-side versions of those rules as well. For example, right now, if someone enters a bad title, that's not going to be validated on the client. Let's see what it takes to make our custom validator run on the client too. There are several possible ways of implementing custom client-side validation. I'm going to show you the most general purpose way of all. It's fairly straightforward, although you probably wouldn't just guess what the client-side syntax is without seeing an example. First, remember this excluded words validator that we created. It implements model validator, and ASP.NET MVC knows how to call it to get the validation results on the server. There's also a method you can override called getClientValidationRules, and the framework will call this when it's building the JSON description of all your rules. We need to return a sequence of model client validation rules, or in this case just one, so I'll create a new instance and I'll assign a couple of properties on it. Firstly, I'll specify which error message we should send down to the client, and we'll just take that from the error message constant on this class. Also, we need to specify validation type. Now that's just an arbitrary string which we choose to use as a name for this type of rule. We'll be looking for this string later when we implement the client-side validation logic. I'm going to call it excluded words. Also, we can pass an arbitrary collection of extra parameters down to the client by putting values into a dictionary called validation parameters. In this case, we're going to need to tell the client which words are excluded. The framework will take its best guess at how to serialize this in JavaScript object notation form. So if it's a fairly simple type, like a string, an int, or an array, then it'll probably work fine. But if it's a very complex custom object type, then it might well not serialize properly, and you might need to convert it to some simpler type manually. Anyway, in this case, we've now got enough information to send down to the client, so I'll yield return that rule. Hopefully that's all we have to change on the server. If I compile and reload this page now, we can have a look at the HTML source code again, and if I do a search for excluded words, we can see that the JSON definition of our validation rules now includes the excluded words rule. It includes the custom error message, and it also includes the extra parameters that we asked to pass down. So I guess you're wondering now how we extract all that data and do something useful with it. Well, we have to write a bit of JavaScript now. The Microsoft MVC validation script allows us to register new validators into a registry of validators. I'm going to start by creating a new JavaScript file, just so that we can keep it separate from any other client-side code. In my scripts folder, I'll add a new item, and I will call it custom validation rules. And this is the bit that's really not obvious. And probably the only way you're going to know how to do this is just to copy and paste someone else's example and then amend it. What we have to do is say sys.mvc.validator.validators. And now into this array, I'm going to add an entry that matches the name of our rule. And remember this arbitrary string that we decided earlier? So we're saying that whenever the Microsoft MVC validation script finds a rule of type excluded words, it should call the following function to find out how to handle it. Now the framework passes in this parameter, which we've called rule, and we can use that to get all the parameters from the rule definition. For example, we can get all the words that have been passed down to the client. We can also get the error message that we're going to use if the rule's violated. And now the framework expects us to return a function that can validate a given value. In JavaScript, it's quite normal to be passing functions around and returning one function from another function. I know that's quite unusual in C#, although there is a fairly similar thing with delegates and lambdas and such like. In this case, we're returning a function that takes the value to be validated, and then we have to implement the logic, which is that we're going to iterate over all the words that should be excluded, and if we find one of those words, we're going to return an error message. So here's the JavaScript code. We're going to iterate over the words array, and if the value that we're validating contains the current word, then we'll return the error message. And just like we did on the server, we'll tell the user exactly which word it is that they're not allowed to use. Okay, now if the function's still running by now, then it must have gone through all the words and decided that none of them were there. So in this case, we'll return true to say that the value is acceptable. Now I know that's not all very obvious, especially not if you're a bit uncomfortable with JavaScript, but it's not all that complex if you've got a working example and you can amend it to your own requirements. Okay, the last thing we need to do is reference our custom validation rules JavaScript file, and I'll do that from the site master page again. And hopefully now we've actually got working client-side validation for our custom rule. I'll reload this page. And we can see that all the other validators are still there, and I'll try entering some bad data now. And there we go, before I even submit the form, I've instantly got a validation error. And the other words should be validated as well. That's all good. And if someone enters data that's legitimate, then there is no validation rule. And we should be able to submit the form in this case. Okay, so we didn't have to change very much of our server-side code. All we had to do is go to our custom model validator object and override the get client validation rules and return a model client validation rule that describes all the parameters. We give our rule an arbitrary name, and then we register a validator on the client against that same name, specifying a function that can be run to perform that validation using all the parameters that have been passed down from the server. And the best thing, of course, is that it works.